People I've worked for or consulted with the last few years, and where some of my work has used jobs to be done. It was actually at MailChimp back in 2013. Crikey, it's 10 years ago now. When we started using jobs to be done. And it was at that time where one of my colleagues brought Bob Mester. So those of you who have read stuff would know who he is, but those of you who haven't, don't worry, I'll introduce him. We worked with Bob and Chris at the time and sort of implemented those into our framework and part of our tool set. And so it's during the time when I worked with MailChimp and I led their research initiatives in Europe. Since then, I've used kind of like a habit you can't shake. Once you know how to think in it, you just don't lose it, like a bad habit. So I've used it with various parts of my work with clients when the occasion calls for it, because there are times when jobs to be done is not the right tool, and we're going to talk about that too. Used it when I led design at the Telegraph Media Group, as well as when I was head of research at ClearLeft, which is actually here in Brighton. So there you are. What these logos don't tell you is that I started my career as a full stack engineer, and I was a product lead for my own startup back in 2008. And somewhere in between, I did product design and a strategist. So yeah, it's I feel very fortunate that I started working in tech in an era where there were less specializations and job titles were kind of fluid. So one of the easiest things to confuse about jobs to be done, so I'll start with this, is what is a job? And how is it different from a task? So I just want to know how, maybe the easiest way to just sort of make that differentiation is through a story. How many of you know what this is? Oh, we have a coffee connoisseur here. Have you got one? Have you used one? Yes? No, okay. So it is an espresso machine, if you could call it that, because the actual machine bit requires you to pump your arms, kind of like if you know those wine openers, it sort of works like this. The idea is that you pump up and down and you build up enough pressure in that vessel and you get the espresso shot out. My partner brought this home one day in January 2017. And it's quite big. I mean, it looks small in this picture, but it's enough it's like the base of that laptop, basically. So it took up like a quarter of you have one, you must do. Okay. I love this part of the talk. Coffee is a bit weird at this hour, but please humor me. So anyway, we like coffee, and it's going to show in a few slides. In our kitchen cupboard, we had this. It's also a coffee maker. It's a Bodum French press, but it's unbreakable. It's double-walled. I got it because my darling partner broke the last one and decided that we'll never get another one again. So this one is going to outlive us. But that's not how I make my coffee. This is how I make my coffee. And I see the smiles around the room, and I know that. So who are the coffee people in this room? AeroPress folks? Okay. So for those who are curious about these weird things, this is halfway between a French press and an espresso machine. So the way it works is you brew in that sort of vessel. If you know what you're doing, you do it upside down because it looks weird, and you press it down like a syringe, and through that you create the pressure for the espresso, or sort of the extraction of the flavor. Really excellent little kit. So this is my favorite way of making coffee. Now you know something about me. But in order to do that in the morning, I've got this down to a fine art. I can make my coffee in 3 minutes between this and this. In the morning, I am usually too sleepy to really do anything complicated, so it's a one-button touch for me if I want to grind my coffee. When this came home, I mean, it's a beautiful object. We can't deny it. I had quite a lot of fun watching my partner struggle with this for a while. But the thing is, this grinder is not going to grind fine enough for an espresso. And so we ended up having another thing that came home. Usually he doesn't tell me these things, so it just shows up. So this, for example, what do you think it is? I think this is more obvious. Grinder. Okay, a beautiful object. If that's one thing, the person I'm married to, he's very good at doing nice-looking, beautiful things. Now, so this is also quite big. It's about a quarter of the size of that. Takes up, when you have a small kitchen, which is most of us, it's kind of dwarfs the space. But what is also interesting is that you can only grind from one side. And so that has to hang over the counter. So there's very specific places you have to put it in your kitchen. And then this is a right-handed machine. We're both left-handed. It's really fun. Now, the problem with when you get started down this route about following what you love first thing in the morning, you end up with a tamper because you wanted to sort of flatten the coffee to get the proper espresso. You end up having a little silicone mat so that you don't hurt the bench when you are pressing down too hard on the coffee group. And then you end up having a knockbox because, when the pot comes out of the thing, it's too hot. You can't put it straight into the bin, so you need a thing. So you can see what this happened in our household. And so for a while, I was like, what happened to us? Like, why did we end up having this thing? How do we go on this route? I have a barista certificate, but don't make me make coffee for you because I'm so out of practice. At one point, I thought about getting one of these. Sorry, what? Bit complicated, yeah. For making coffee. Yeah, I probably wouldn't today, but I wouldn't ask you how much do you think this cost, because anyway, several years prior to that, we were in Tuscany and we went to Italy. I was jokingly thinking we'll come back with a coffee maker. This is a La Pavone single manual espresso maker, so you got to know what you're doing. It's all mechanical. Lucky for us, the shop was shut. So I did not come back with a coffee maker. This was around £1,500. I wouldn't have spent that money anyway had I known, but I looked it up afterwards like, oh, phew. Even... Grazie. So we came back with a much less expensive Bialetti, which was £25 or €25, whatever it was, and 2 ceramic pans, and that serviced us for a while. Turns out to be a good decision because we have an Italian colleague or friend who had the La Pavone, the complicated machine, and ended up using one of these instead. This is a nanopresso. Have you seen this one? Yes. Do you have one? No. You've just seen it before. So you know how it works. So you've got you can put either a capsule at the top or you can flatten your grounds at the top. You've got your water there, and then you turn it down and you kind of like press it like a bike pump, essentially how it's work. Mechanics and physics of making coffee, excellent. So when the Bialetti stopped being consistent, we end up with one of these. We still have it. It's actually great for camping. Love it. But we don't use it too often because it's quite a lot of effort first thing in the morning to go like this for your coffee. Should I have gotten one of these? If I like one-button things, the environmentalist in me find these terribly wasteful, so I still haven't got one of these, just I can't, reconcile with it. But this is so you can see this everywhere, right? This is almost in every hotel, almost in most offices, and most of my friends have one of these, so it's interesting, and we've not gone down that route. So, however, the rock. This is a rock. We didn't keep it for very long because it just kept misbehaving. It was very unpredictable, and we sold it. The only thing we kept was that tin at the back because it's actually quite pretty and useful. Instead, now we came up, well, actually what showed up in the house, I don't even say, it just appeared one day, more or less. My partner brought back the Gaccia, and this actually was not without its troubles. But it's been mostly consistent since about October 2019. I'm keeping track now because it's important for us to keep track of what comes and goes. It's 4 years. It feels like a long-term relationship with a coffee maker. Because of that, obviously, you need to find a grind, and therefore we have another guy of these. So this is the Rocky. It's still in the house. Anyway, so my question for you now, with this very, very long coffee journey, is what do you think my jobs to be done were? Do we have it? I'll just repeat whatever you say because then that way it would go through the stream. So go on. To feel more awake. Any other thoughts about what my jobs were? To drink the coffee. Grinding the coffee. That's close. Yeah. Anyone? Maybe one more. Get rid of the waste. Yeah. Pretty close. They're all jobs in different levels. So let's have a look at what I have to do and all the things which comes into the effect of making coffee. Espresso, specifically for the nerds in the room. Doughs, whey beans. I've got to grind the coffee. I have to tamp it, and I have to make the brew or extract, and maybe froth milk if I wanted to. I don't. I have my coffee black. That's it. There you go. So, but doughs and whey beans, that's a task, right? Because why are you doing that? The reason why you're doing that is you're trying to ensure that you've got the right concentration of coffee to water. Important if you want to control the taste. And in the same way, if you're grinding coffee, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to get the right granularity for the right brew, and given the character of the beans, which differ depending on where it comes from and who roasts it. Ooh, this is a lot about coffee. Tamping is what you're creating a consistent surface for an even extraction, right? You're trying to get this nice smooth surface, compact, and get it so that you can get a good extraction from it. And when you make the brew or an extract, you are trying to extract the maximum flavor, or you can have multiple types of jobs from that task. You may have multiple goals with one task, which is you're making the right coffee to the right person's taste. In my case, an AeroPress is probably, I don't do espresso very much, but there you go. So here's a list of what you can think of as jobs. There are probably more. And if there's one thing to know if you're writing a job well is to make sure that there's no solution in it. So none of these statements actually tell you how I'm doing it. And that way, if you are framing a problem, describing a user need, you are focusing on the issue rather than how you're going to solve it. And that way, it opens you up for innovating for ideas. Really key. It took me a while to get this right. But so that's a huge tip. There are other ones that I shared. It fits on the kitchen counter or doesn't. It looks good, the rest of our kitchenware, and minimum waste. Someone mentioned that, exactly what's important to me. However, after long, long years of reflection, and I can say that, the thing that seems to stop us, like every time we change a piece of equipment, is we can't make a perfect espresso every time. And it's about consistency as it is about the whole sort of like little steps along the way or the ritual, whatever. And this is what I would call a core job. And therefore the why, the core job gives you the why. Whenever this is not satisfied as a criteria, we fire the current thing and we hire something else. And that's the language you use with jobs to be done. You're hiring or firing the solution, essentially. Okay, and so if that's a core job and that's the why, then the ones that we've spoken about are kind of the how levels. It's a slightly lower level in terms of a job, okay? Is that clear? Now, all of a sudden are also coffee experts and jobs to be done. So no, I think we did well there. I'm now going to go into the detail. So strap in. They are 3 or 4 schools, well, I won't say 3-ish schools of approaches. And I'll go in, it's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but so by the end of this, hopefully it'll be quite clear and you know where to look for the resources. That sort of gives you more depth. So there's Tony Ulwick with outcome-driven innovation and his approach from Strategen. Good names to remember because they're good search terms as well. The jobs to be done Switch interview, primarily driven by Bob Moester. At the time when we worked with Bob, he was partnering with Chris and Alan Clement on demand thinking. Okay, so they all have books. They're very easily findable. So Jobs to be Done by Tony Ulwick, Jobs to be Done, the handbook, which I actually really like that book. It's really, really thin and it shows off the interview technique quite well. We can go into that in detail. And When Coffee and Kale Compete, which is Alan Clement's book. So outcome-driven innovation generally has sounded quite complicated, mostly because Strategen talks about it, but they also sell it as a service. So to some degree, I feel like sometimes it's really difficult to get down to the nitty-gritty of what they actually do in their process. And so one of the things I did do, Tony Ulwick wrote a paper for the Harvard Business Review in 2002. One of the things I did was when I grabbed the book, I mapped to see what things got repeated between the paper and the book because I'm a nerd. So what you would see is actually most of it does map. There's only 2 or 3 factors which are new in the book, which was the universal job map, which I will also touch on, and just some chapters towards the end around like growth strategy, innovation strategy, market and product strategy. So just different approaches there. However, what I want to focus on is really the sort of the research side of it, because I think what you notice is jobs to be done comes from a market research route. So a lot of it is the lens that you have to adopt. When you come from sort of like user-centered design or product design, we take a slightly different view, right? This is relevant to us, but some of the terminology may be slightly different. For example, the word personas may mean something different. So the ODI research methodology, I'm just going to use the short acronym for now. It is, if you look at it, it looks like a really solid mixed methods research approach. So you've got the qual, the quant, and a thing at the end that helps you make sense of it. The interviews are capturing the steps and procedures. The difference with how they've done it is they sort of reframe the findings at the insights as outcome statements, which I'll go into detail. For most of us, when we talk about user needs, we might use a job, sort of a user story. As user X, I want this so that I can. Whereas the difference here is that we're looking at the outcomes and the goal. And now that you know what the difference is between a task and a goal, we are focusing on the goal here. Then you get a list of goals from your interviews, you organize, you deduplicate, you categorize them. Those have actually, I'll just ask the question. Top tasks by Jerry McGovern. How many of you have heard of that framework? Okay, keep that one, you have to. Keep that in your pocket. That's also a very similar process. The only difference is not tasks, it's jobs. Okay, so if you know that one, Jerry also has pretty good articles and books on that method. He used to run workshops on that. So the outcome statements can be something like this. So listen to music while on the go. It's a bit of there's a syntax specific on that. You start with a verb, but you already know what that looks like because you saw me use one just now. Pretty simple. You start with a verb, have an object, and you clarify it in the context. The ones that I wish we use more of is called the desired outcome statements. I find these massively useful and I wish we used them more. Between the 2002 and 2016 version, there's very little change. There's a bit more context that Ulrich added to the syntax. But essentially, it reads something like this. Minimize the time for me to make a perfect cup of coffee. Right? So what I love about this type of way to capture insights is you can easily decide how you want to measure the change. So it succeeds if you do help your users minimize the time it takes to make a coffee. And then you can say, how much do I need to minimize it with? And all of a sudden, it becomes easy to set up your measures from a product perspective. Anyhow, so if we go forward, so what you do is that you've got all these statements that you come from interviews and you stick them into a survey. Quite classical way of doing research. You have different types of customers rate this. And so this is an example of what it could look like. This is one of my favorite ones. List of jobs on the side and then getting people to select maybe like scale of 1 to 5. I prefer 1 to 6 because then you don't land in the middle. How important this job is and how satisfied they are at the moment with their existing solution. If you have questions on the survey, we can talk about it in the break, but I know that this has been really difficult for people to implement, generally speaking, because often you can end up with lots and lots of jobs and all of a sudden your survey is unusable. There's one trick I have done in the past when that happened. That's where I actually stuck in the first question and get people to select what ones apply to them. And that way you also know which jobs are least applicable. So that is one data point. And the other one is then you can, so then they don't have to answer it for all the things and just the ones that are relevant to them. So there are tricks around that when you design a survey for this sort of stuff. Okay. And then, in theory, you should be able to like map out what's overserved and underserved. So where it's a very important job, an outcome people want, but they're not satisfied with the solution, that's where you should focus your efforts, right? It sounds really simple. There is a version of it. So this is generally like ODI research in a nutshell, but there is a company called Venbridge. They're Swiss, and they have formalized a really effective framework, very similar, sort of based on the ODI, in what they call job metrics. And you recognize that this looks like a job statement, but in reverse. So you talk about the expected result first, the unit, and the context. This is a talk that they do. You can actually find it online. On cooking, like they were innovating on a new piece of cookware. So this was one of the examples of the job. The stains in the pan are removed as quickly as possible when they're burnt in. What is great about the Venbridge way of doing things? So they do the interview formats, and they're just interviews for very specific stuff. And then it allows them to basically map very similar things, but with accuracy on the importance and fulfillment. And they map it out like this, and you can see where the gaps are. And that's where you focus your efforts. So we'll keep the questions to the end. Write down if you've got questions. I know I'm going pretty fast. So if you're a quant type person, there are a number of types of other surveys that we know how to do, but we don't do it with jobs to be done often, and we probably can. So if you know Kano, which is a particular way of looking at delight, and MaxDiff, similar about like basically important or least important types of features. Not a quant workshop today, so I'm not going into this, apologies. But just to say, there are other ways to use this tool. So essentially, that is the outcome-driven innovation framework in terms of how it works. Now, the new stuff that came out in 2016 was around the job map, and this is probably one of the most useful things I find, like for things like when you're working through where you want to focus your efforts. You already know how to do that because I cheated and I showed you how you might do that, right? So here, let's take that first one. This might be like a main job, and you may have like more specific things more specific goals you're going to go for. So if you're ensuring the right concentration of coffee to water, maybe it's around determine the best type of coffee for the right type of drink. That's a job. Getting the water to the right temperature is probably also a job. I might not have phrased it quite so well, but you know what I mean. Now, remember the Nespresso I talked about earlier? This is why it is very successful. You can see the capsules, those little things, actually satisfy three core jobs, and make it really easy. And the machine itself does the extraction, and probably a little bit about the water stuff. But yeah, so you can see why that product is so successful and is everywhere, because it makes things so easy. And I don't think they really, I don't know if they use JTBD. I'd be interested to find out. But there you go, that's the model. Now I'm going to switch gears and talk about the switch method. It's also called a JT interview, just to be confusing. I knew of it as a switch interview, so I might interchange the words. It is a methodology that is based on customer case research developed in the 1980s by Denise Nitterhouse. Often forgotten, actually, women who develop new ways of doing things. So the switch methodology is interesting because, well, firstly, in the 80s, they did it in a certain way. Our industry has changed. So the key philosophy is, if you can find out why people switch to you and why they switch away, you can find the jobs to be done. So it's the interview method specifically designed to help you find the jobs, or help. Actually, what happens is that when you've done some of these interviews, people will just tell you, the words would just come out. The switch interview technique, the way that Chris and Bob used to teach it, they have very specific things they try to get you to do. They try to get you to talk about the weather, who's there in the room with you, and they try to preface it by saying, think about it like filming a documentary. We're going to ask weird stuff, time of day, things like that. Now, if you take a look at why, the reason why is this is like a map that you're trying to fill in as you are conducting the interview. What you're really doing is you're extracting a story from someone. And that's why when you ask them about the time of day, you ask them about location and who is with you, you're actually trying to get them to, bring their memories back and getting them to tell you a story. It's very clever as a method. It's very clever and very adaptable. So you might start with the first thought, or you don't have to start with the first thought. You can ask someone, when was the last time? What do you remember of your grandfather, using this thing? which actually is some of the interviews I had run before when I run about newspapers. When were you first aware, right? But actually what happens is a story can begin at any point. And having done like lots and lots of these types of interviews, actually these days I would say, when did you buy that thing? And so that's the moment of commitment. So I can go at length about the technique, but there's a really good tool that Bob and Chris were using for analysis, and it's called the forces diagram, which is actually based on something else called the Kurt-Lewin force field analysis. Very useful for change management. So essentially, you can almost take this out and use it apart from using jobs to be done, because it's a tool in its own right. So it looks at the forces that will make someone choose a solution and what stops them from choosing a solution. So it is a very useful little analysis tool. It's also in that little book. This is what's not in the book. So the thing about switch interviews is it assumes that the person you're interviewing has agency, which is not always true, and it can be a problem in certain circumstances. But for one of the really common cases is B2B. So if your end user is not the one who purchased the software or the thing, then you've got two sets of users you need to interview. So you need to chat with two groups. Pretty straightforward, hopefully, I hope. Okay, moving on. Most of you would be familiar with this, those of you who have done JTBD, do I see? Okay, is that what you use as well, just to say when you were using jobs to be done? Yes? Okay. I think this article was probably the most famous, really, the one about ditching personas and ditching user stories in order for job stories. I'm of the mind that is a tool. If it makes sense to use it, use it. If it doesn't, you can use whatever you like in order to express the need. That's more important. However, for those of us who come across this for the first time, you might be used to the user need saying, as user X, I want to so that I can. This is just for emphasis on the situation and the context. So there's very, very slight but important change. When I'm rushing to get out the door in the morning, that's the context. I don't actually anymore because I work at home, but oh well. I want a fail-safe way to make coffee so that I can be energized on the way to work. So that's an example of how that would look if we use that same question. Okay. Last but not least, Alan Clement is really interesting when he came on the scene. This is also where lots of public discussions took place about which frameworks made more sense or more relevant or more correct about jobs to be done. And I think it caused a lot of confusion. But what Alan brought to the conversation was, he's quite an intellectual guy, if you've met him before. So he found, I think the way he explained certain things helped clarify why this method works. So he talks about essentially an old me to a new improved me idea of the sort of self-progression. And this is true for so many things. Once you start thinking this way, it's hard to shake it off. So he talks about use goals versus be goals. I do, I want, so that I can experience. And also, use goals are product-centric, the start-stop stuff, the coffee machine, the start and end of that. But the B goals are always on and they're context-centric. So, in my example, when I'm making coffee in the morning, I want to invest minimal effort for the taste to get it right. So that's a use goal. The B goal is I just want to get through the morning or the day, and I want to look like I'm half awake when I'm on my first conference call. So that's a B goal. Clement also did a thing where, this is probably less known, I think he did post about this a while ago. You have different, basically if you did your switch interviews, this is another way to look at the analysis. It's not too different from, say, if you studied triggers and barriers and that kind of stuff in interviews before. But what I do like about this is he talks about catalysts, like what started the process, and things like capturing the choice set. What other things have people tried? So, and he very kindly shared this data set with me. It's made up, I think it's a made up one. Where you can, sorry, I know it's really too small for anybody to read, but you have to trust me. So you list your unmet goals, you list your constraints, your catalyst of what started those things, and what people chose as a potential solution. Right, that was a lot. But it should give you the lay of the land on the different approaches of jobs to be done. So there are three, most things you see out there now will come from these routes, essentially. So hopefully there are enough keywords in there that if you want to look them up, you can find them and you know where they live now and where they come from. So when and how? I want to say that jobs to be done is probably better at early stages of product discovery, or unless you're using an existing product as a springboard and you're trying to pivot. Usually when the problem space is known. And so let's look at the tools you have. So job statements and outcome statements, where can you use them? I'm using sort of like a proxy double diamond type language here. This is the updated systems design framework that uses different words. So job statements, outcome statements, they're great as sort of like North Star vision, so you know what you're trying to achieve. And in fact, if you work with the public service like we do at DXW, good services actually sound like good job statements. It's just like almost a one-to-one match. And job stories, the when contextual type description, they come a bit later because you need a bit more, you need to have done some of the contextual research to get the different situations that it applies. So they still work as North Stars, but a little bit later in the process. Switch interviews for me tend to be better when you are pivoting in a product. And the job map, however, is something that, I've changed my mind about this over time. I think it can be very useful at the beginning when you're figuring out where you are focusing your efforts, but you can always you can always come back to it and say, actually, we need to either pivot, we need to focus down, these are the things that are not satisfied, and this is where we need to invest our efforts. So yeah, and the ODI, the outcome-driven innovation, the stuff that Venbridge does is really like pre-product design. It's like really like up that strategy front, trying to figure out where the market is and where the opportunities are. Alrighty. The research toolbox. I want to do this map because then you can see, like visually, even though you can't read the words very well, these different frameworks, they don't all do all the things, you know what I'm trying to say. Like you can actually lean on one for sort of like the data gathering, but use different parts of the synthesis and modeling according to what you are trying to achieve. So, and Ulrich has been known to say, and don't quote me on this, I can't remember why I came across this. You might be able to, for example, if you've got already sets of interviews, set of evidence and data, you can use those as a foundation and use job statements to synthesize what you already know. Do a workshop with your team to figure out where you think, what your job stories are, and use it as a kind of a synthesis and what I call like the measure of wisdom type method. Where are we? As a bit of an evaluation. One of the better books I feel that is very comprehensive, that's more pragmatic, is by my friend Jim. If you probably use JTBD, you probably know seen this book. If you're new to it, it's probably the more pragmatic one that's very helpful in terms of actually applying it. Righto. When do you use jobs to be done? Can you identify a hiring and firing point? So they are, in the number of times I've done the consulting and coaching over the years, we have seen that there are certain things that jobs to be done does not do well at. If you can't identify someone choosing consciously a solution, is probably the wrong framework to use. So the other one is actually interesting because how well defined is your problem space? If it's like an open green field that nobody knows anything about, it's probably not the right method, because jobs to be done as a framework requires things like, how do people do things now? How do people, are they using a thing already? And so it can be challenging to apply, not to say it will never apply, it's challenging to apply if there are multiple, very different jobs for one singular solution. For example, a laptop or a mobile phone. If you are trying to do that, you want to scope right down to the function that you're focusing on. Similarly, multiple value propositions. For example, a holiday. We've had people try to do JTBD on a holiday and find that they don't know how to use the data afterwards, because why do we go on holiday? Your reason is going to be different from mine. Like one job that I could remember was like something around when someone's child is 18 years old, they want to go on a specific holiday because it's the last time all of them would do it together as a family. Like trying to express that, and then that's going to be different from a couple going on their honeymoon, right? The jobs are just so far apart that you won't be able to design anything in order to satisfy those conditions. So, or the audience is too diverse, could be difficult to quantify. Same thing. So it's perfect for when there is a known problem space, but the problem is not as clearly defined. Okay, so we know the space. Food is also another bad one. Is food. If you want to do food, you want to focus down on maybe like organic food, or even then that might be even too broad. So for holidays, for example, maybe you can say cruises, like one type that you know is already existing, and then like deviate out from there. Okay. What happens if hiring is not an individual choice? This is a really interesting question. So several years ago, someone, actually it was Jim that sent this person to me, from a very large company, which I shall not name, came to me to ask, how do I apply JTBD in their context, which is an organization trying to help a community around food. And obviously like food, I got triggered. I was like, oh no. But it's because it's complicated. If the decision is a community-based, the external decisions feed into individual choice. So all of a sudden, it's sort of funny way to say it, but the method is a narrative method, and the narrative method is based on the Western storytelling style. So if you're in a community where it's less individualistic and high context, some of the stuff may need to be adapted. Not to say you can't do it, but you just have to be aware of the limitations of the tool. So yeah, basically, essentially, before you start using JTBD, I would recommend that you know why you're hiring jobs to be done as a tool. It's an approach, is a way to look at things. So it really depends on what you're trying to do with it. And then you can decide which part of, or which framework, which approach, which part of the tool set will be most useful to help you get to where you want to go. This showed up 3 weeks ago. Yeah, he showed me some videos. I wasn't really paying attention. So there you go. That's what happens when you don't pay attention. This is our new friend, the robot. It's fully manual. Everything is replaceable and repairable. It's quite tiny. It's about like this. And I've been using this every day. There you go. So if you're looking for a gacha, come and talk to me afterwards. The job never ends. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steph. That was that was great. I was totally immersed in that. We've probably got a couple of minutes for some questions. We're running a tiny bit behind. Does anyone have any questions for Steph? And then we will take a short break before we bring on our second speaker. Anyone? Come on, don't be shy. I've got one for you then, Steph. Okay, so for those of you out there who hasn't done the Jobs to be Done framework, I know you gave some great examples there of books to get started. How long would you say it would take before someone would be in a position to get moving on this? And is there a chance that they might get stuck in straight away and perhaps maybe go wrong or mess it up? Oh, there you go.
It's just about too easy to mess up as any other interview or any other research design process that you've got. So I would just try it and see where it takes you. A lot of people start with job stories because it's quite straightforward. It's a translation from how you might express user needs. The job map might be a good place to start because most of you, I'm assuming, that would have done at least some kind of either a service mapping, or you might have mapped out sequence of tasks. So it's probably a very small step to translate that into sort of a job context. So I might start there. Those are my, but try whatever makes sense. Just don't be afraid. If it doesn't work, chuck it and try the next thing.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Yeah, at the back.
Thank you very much for that. It was really insightful, and the survey bit with the pre-selecting what you're referring to is really, really great. I had a question around when you go from your survey to the job map, I get a bit lost, and then you end up with, how do you prioritize your kind of job map, and how do you kind of group relevant things? That's the bit where things kind of break down a bit, I find sometimes for me.
I'm have to ask you then, like the kinds of jobs that you're putting into the survey, were they certain ones? Did you get like the results to sort of narrow down to a small subset?
Yeah, I think they were quite narrow. I think they were quite narrow jobs at the end of it in the survey, so maybe too narrow. I don't know. Maybe that's wrong.
And how many were they roughly?
Probably. Well, I mean, it depends, but I mean, between not many, like 6 to 15. This was like kind of small client. Yeah, so yeah.
Okay, that seems to be workable. I might use that as a starting point. And what you probably want to see is, I mean, at the end of the day, I think the thing to keep in mind is this is a tool to help you figure out how best to develop what you need to work with. And the language that is on the page is only a sequence of words that helps you to clarify things. So if you find that the jobs you have become like different levels, like they feel like too granular, trying to figure out what is it supposed to be in the missing parts. Like one of the things I might do is just like lay them out and see, do they feel like they're about the same level of implementation? There was a product manager, head of product way back when, who gave me a really good guideline. I wish I could remember it, but something around, if you can imagine trying to t-shirt-size it, like obviously the higher level jobs would feel like more like an epic, and you have the gut sense for that because you've done this before. So try that as a start and see where you get to.
That's great.
Perhaps.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.